So yeah, this office hours, I'm going to be covering spawning, what we call spawning and streaming hacks. So, so that's to
Okay.
like get your world as performant as possible when dealing with spawning and world streaming. And so, just real quick, I'm Tellus, Matt Torres, but Tellus and Horizon. I am an expert creator, so hopefully you can get some really good info here today about just spawning and performance in general. Just some quick housekeeping stuff. The session is recorded. If you have any questions at the end, feel free to raise your hands. As far as like during the session, if you mute yourself while the session's going, feel free to keep it active in the chat. Hang out in the chat. Talk amongst each other. I'll peek over every now and then. But yeah, the after the session, there will be a feedback survey that would be super helpful if all of you all filled it out. And we'll get going then. So, what this session covers is how to use performance metrics to identify spawning related performance issues. So if you are building a world where you have spawning and you're noticing that the frame rates are dropping, either if you're doing it in VR, you're feeling like the game kind of freezes for a little while, or you might see it on mobile or web. You just see kind of like freezing happening whenever you're spawning your assets. Well, this session will cover what we can do for optimizing that and trying to remove the spikes as much as possible. I'll be covering techniques for breaking up large assets and strategies for timing spawning, asset spawning to avoid the frame rate reduction. So right here, with just a quick tap on the skills matrix alignment, this will be mostly focused on the Horizon systems. Uh, Kind of out of my ordinary where I often cover scripting. This one won't be very scripting related, but there will be a moment where I touch it briefly, but this is mostly just like a systems uh session where you will mostly do things using the tracing and the performance metrics views, as well as the creator portal where you can download the traces that you do. And we'll get all into that here in just a moment. If you attended the previous performance session hosted by Pigeon, you may see some familiar concepts here. This will cover specifically the spawning side of things. All right. So, viewing performance metrics, if you're unfamiliar with how to see the state of your world when it comes to frame rate and performance, these areas here are how you would access them. So, in VR, if you're looking at your wrist menu, which is, when you look down, you would see a utilities menu that has a tracing option, or real-time metrics if you're just kind of looking at the live playtest data, and I'll show that in the next slide. And in web, you would press the P key, and in mobile, you would press the wrench icon. So what happens when you open up the performance metrics, or what do we call them? Yes, the real-time metrics. When you look at the performance metrics, you will see different stats that you can track. Uh, for example, by default, mine had FPS, which is frames per second, and GPU time, or in milliseconds here. And underneath those stats, you'll see a target that is basically what you hope to achieve, the numbers you hope to achieve. As your game is running, you're constantly seeing the real-time output of what that number is. So that is a play test inspection is what that's called when you're reading it from this view. And like I said, it's live. The other way you can identify like issues is through a deep trace, which for viewing that, you would have to use what's called Perfetto. If you're unfamiliar with that, it's basically a website where you can read the metrics that are output from horizon during a deep trace, and we will definitely be going over that in the next few slides. So just to make a quick note here, how you can, what does it mean when you're having performance issues is when your frames per second has long spikes or is consistently under 60 frames per second in web and mobile and 72 frames per second in VR. So that once again, if you're spawning things into your world and you're seeing for, long amounts of time or just like an uncomfortable amount of time, if you notice that it's freezing, then this is probably one place you should definitely look, and you're in the right place because we're going to talk about how to break it all down. So getting started with the metrics here, right? Is like I mentioned, there are some numbers that are displayed on the performance metrics view, which are just like suggested numbers that basically show that your world is quite optimized. What we want to do, though, is kind of keep track of those numbers and have a sort of repository for ourselves of like, well, I saw it do, these amount of milliseconds. I saw it do this amount of frame rate, right? And so how can we get that sort of file for ourselves that prove that at the base, right, at a blank world, we know what the numbers can be, right, at its best performance, right? Nothing in world and very few players in world, right? So how can we retrieve that is basically you're going to want to set up a blank world. And in this blank world, you can use NPCs to simulate player count and just to like, keep track of avatar performance impacts. And so what you'll do is trace the file using the tracing options that were available on your Risk menu or the recording button. And I'll demonstrate that here in the next slide. Once you've retrieved that file, or once you've retrieved the trace, you can download the trace from the performance page of the creator portal. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that link into the chat just so you all have it. If you're not aware, this is like when you're doing your traces, this page is where those traces end up. And so when you have done a trace in your world, you'll notice that there's client traces, which I've summarized as how the player's device is affected, performance-wise, and then server files are where it's showing you how the world server is affected. Main thing to do with those baseline trace files once you've got them is to keep them somewhere safe where you can continue to reference them and basically sanity check yourself whenever you're sort of needing to remember what those baseline numbers are. So let's take a look at how to do that, right? So collecting the trace, what this is basically the record function of the performance metrics view. So this little icon right here, when you press that, it starts the trace, and it's basically keeping a record of all the things happening within your world, right? When you have the profile, the trace type set to deep, you'll see here it says uncover possible ways to optimize parts of your world viewable in Perfetto. So this is like you're really getting into the nitty gritty of what things are running at any like during each frame, right? But there are these other options that you can record with too. Overview is a great one for like if you don't want it to get so detailed. It sort of makes sure that it gives you like a baseline frames per second that you can skim in Perfetto. And we'll take a look at what the deep one looks like. So you can basically extrapolate what you'll understand what you can do with overview once you've seen what deep can do. Playtest at the moment, I have not had very much luck with, but what my assumption is there is that when you record and playtest, you should be able to open it in desktop editor to where you can just you can see basically the same information that you see on your performance metrics view. You can see them within the desktop editor as a still instead of a live stream of it. So for the deep trace, in regards to spawning specifically, what you're going to want to do is I would recommend tracing for like 10 seconds so that you have some what I call some baseline before and after you do your spawn, right? So that's to say, like, if you find that there is, if you're when you're going to see whether your spawn is actually affecting your world, the time before and after that you've activated your spawn will have a pretty like slim size of the frame. So for example, 60 frames per second, you'll see 16 milliseconds of frame rate. 72 seconds, 72 frames per second, you'll see 13 milliseconds of the frame time. So when you start the deep trace, you can wait a couple seconds. I suggest like 2 or 3 to start the trace, so that like when the trace starts up and stops, like you're not receiving any anomalies from that, right? Because like if you think about it, the action of starting a trace would have some impact on the performance as well. So just to avoid that completely, you want to kind of wait a little while before you actually start the spawning itself. So in Perfetto, what would you see? So if you go to the performance page that I sent in the link there, in the chat there, you'll see the on your trace files that appear as as you start your captures and end them. You'll see on that page it'll start to populate like client files and server files, and it'll be named like client underscore zero, server underscore zero, and the number can go up depending on how long your trace was for. Well, to the right of that file, you'll be able to click the Open Trace button, which it'll be a drop down that allows you to select Perfetto from the actual creator portal, which is super nice because it will take that trace file and send it over to that website, the Perfetto website, where you'll be able to see the trace file itself. And so later on in the session, I'll go and demonstrate what that looks like. For now, I have these supporting screenshots that are from a trace that I did with a spawner that was spawning something pretty resource intensive. So once you're on Perfetto and you have like opened up the processes drop down, within there you can find sections that are labeled with spawn information, right? So for example, here we see client spawn. Above it, it says client activate, but from like working with the spawn API, you can you would know that the spawning itself, like the showing of the objects themselves, are ultimately activating, and so that is where you might see something like this line right here. This blue line right here is representative of the impact that it has on the frame rates. I didn't hover over it for the screenshot, but this line up here, you remember how I said you want that like baseline buffer on the start and end? This is what that represents, right? So here we had a steady, in this case, 60 frames per second because I was tracing on mobile. And then you see it just like, whoosh, it shoots down all the way down to 14 frames per second. That is a big indicator that this thing I'm spawning is really impacting the user experience. And so this particular section, this only happened over like 1 second. But in VR, that can be pretty jarring. So you got to kind of make sure that it's kind of worth your while. It definitely is good practice to just follow these performance optimization tips that I'll go over soon. But like play it by ear, just see like is it worth if you've got some, maybe sometimes you got to think about it like uh uh your next world where you go to spawn things, you'll architect it in a way that sort of avoids this issue in the first place. But if you're willing to sort of grit your teeth and go and make the optimizations, then great. You'll resolve issues like this where there's massive spikes that really affect the user experience. So you'll see time markers too within the actual trace itself. So, as you're recording, keep track of the seconds that are passing by so that when you go to look at your files, okay, well, I started recording or I activated the spawn 3 seconds after in my file. 3 seconds after, I should see that dip, right? So this is, looking for those time markers. That's how you're going to find the areas of impact. So, main reason y'all are here, the how do you do it, right? Like, how do you reduce the performance impact that is caused by spawning? So, I've surfaced these four top tips, which I've used. We implemented, several of these performance updates, or sorry, performance enhancements that during Survivor, when creating Survivor Horizon Island, which was a spawn heavy world, right? So we used some of these tips, and so I gathered those thoughts and I'm sharing them with you now. And those tips are reducing the asset size, adjusting the spawn timing, delaying the scripts and physics, and minimizing gizmo use. So let's take a look at what each of those mean. All right. When talking about reducing the asset size, we're talking about the asset itself is, it both has, it can have several entities within it. It could also have large texture files or just like many active scripts that run all at once. There's sort of several aspects that sort of make the asset itself quite bloated, and therefore causing the performance issue. So dividing the asset into smaller parts is like one of the best things you can do for your asset, for your performance. So what you need to take into account is that when you're splitting out these assets, there are moments where you have written some scripts where it expects certain parts of the world to exist. And when you've done this sort of breaking up into smaller parts, you need to make sure that you have coded that, like updated your code so that it reflects that, right? Like sometimes these items aren't in the world, right? So then what do we do? Well, so when you're creating your chain of spawners, what you'll do is you'll create an event listener that's called when the asset finally spawns. So like take for instance, let's say I have a game that that it wants to know where like coins are, right? Just like the location of coins, right? Well, it doesn't have, let's say I spawned in the game asset first, right? And it's in the world, ready to go. And the coins haven't spawned yet. Let's say it happens, quite far down the chain of spawns. At that point, at the point of spawning the game, I want to delay. I want to make sure that it doesn't do any behaviors that, like let's say it was supposed to go and shuffle all the coins and put them all in new locations, like if I was doing like a hide and seek kind of game. Well, those coins have not spawned yet. So what I'll want to do is create an event on those coins where it's going to say to the game, "Hey, I've spawned. We've spawned." And so maybe the game is aware of, like, okay, there's only 8 coins in the game. So once I get the 8th time of that event being called, then I can start, the shuffle logic, right? So that's just one of the things to take into account when splitting up your assets. Another aspect of splitting up your asset is monitoring the textures. And so here I've said that the using textures that have already been loaded into the world is a great way to reduce performance impact from spawning. So that's to say, if you have, let's say you have an atlas of textures in your world, right? Let's say you have like I don't know, a tropical island, perhaps, and you have coconuts that spawn in after the fact, right? Well, if that island, right? Well, that island that you created is like a static asset and it has the texture of the coconut within the like island's atlas of textures. Then when that coconut spawns, if it is using the reference of that same asset, then it will just use the one that's already loaded as opposed to downloading it all over again. So that's a great, save on memory there because it doesn't have to download that. Next, adjust spawn timing, right? So similar, like we talked about the chaining of spawning, right? Uh, that is one way to adjust the time in which something spawns, right? So if we're saying spawn the game first, then spawn the coins, that'll save us some performance impact, especially if we're adding like arbitrary timers, time in between. That's just kind of holding, like adding time so that two things aren't colliding as a when the asset is doing its spawning. So here, first point I mentioned in the spawn timing is that you want to use the load method. So you want to load the asset when doing, when using a spawn controller or a sub-level entity. And that is because it allows the asset to be added into the world without the visuals being rendered or the scripts being executed. So, so that's to say, like spawning the spawning classes, they have this function that is made to try to avoid performance impact already, right? So it's best to try to load the asset instead of just calling the spawn function directly onto the spawn controller. That way, if you when you finally do spawn it, you've basically got as much of the asset in memory as possible, and all that remains is to show it and to run the scripts that are on it. So, if the asset is divided, adding time between spawn activations using async timeouts, that's a great way to, I basically mentioned that earlier. The oh, strap this chair. Sorry. Avoid activating the spawners during intense gameplay. So if your players are, running around throwing stuff, doing interactions and stuff like that, then you're kind of stacking the performance impact of the usual interactive things plus the spawning on top of it. So, how can you avoid that is you can make lobbies or holding areas. Think like Citadel, right? When you go and load a world, you're basically inside a little black box that is loading, and when it loads, you get sent to the cave, and you can continue all your shooting and jumping and flying and all that stuff, right? So this is the reason why Citadel does has to optimize on the spawning. Delay and scripts and physics. So when you use async timeouts in the beginning of your like typical start logic is what I called it, then you allow the script side of things to not impact the spawning as well, right? So like remember earlier I mentioned that concept of the game knowing about needing to shuffle the coins, right? Let's say it had other behaviors like calculating or like getting the hide locations, right? Getting the actual positions of like empty objects around the space so that it knows where to hide the coins. Well, something like that is like something that could be delayed, right? If you if you have behavior like these four I've listed, then it's a candidate for delaying that logic. So things like getting the objects in world by tag or getting position rotation of entities, updating custom UI bindings, playing sounds or particle gizmos. Those are things that, ideally you are able to delay on when spawning. If you can't, if it's part of the user experience to actually do those things, then you gotta do what you can. But if possible, try to like defer those as long as possible. Use loading screens. Use like just like trigger events that happen by maybe you put a trigger event far away from a player to then make something happen, right? And give it enough time, enough space between the player and where that trigger is expected to be touched, so that you're sort of like adding in time buffers that will allow everything to kind of settle down and allow the frame rate to reach its optimal speed. So one more thing you can do: reduce physics calculations. So when you're saving your assets, turning off the collision is ideal, right? When that object spawns, then it's not part of the physics calculations; it's just ignored. And then you'll turn it on when you need it, right? So similar to like the scripts being delayed, collision being delayed as well is another great way to avoid the impacts of spawning. For this, I said consider spawning physics assets at the end of the spawn chain, and that's because like physics assets are interesting, right? Because they have the when they're simulated, right, they're going to fall, right? They're going to drop down with gravity. So you don't want to turn the collider off on that thing, right? Because then it's just going to fall through the floor. Now you could consider setting simulated to false on start, but then you're kind of running into the whole dilemma with starting a script after a spawn. That might not be as costly if it's just like a couple items, but if you've got several physics items that are spawning in and they all are setting their simulated to false, and then eventually going to true, that might be a whole new impact that you weren't expecting that you don't want to have. So if you spawn them at the end of the chain, then that assumes that maybe your environment that has collision will be where it needs to be, so that the item just falls there, say like on a table or the floor or whatever. It'll just fall and be in a good spot, and you don't have to worry about the turning off its collisions because it's the last thing anyways, right? Like hopefully you've delayed enough things to where the last most impactful thing can just kind of spawn like regular. All right, and then finally, we have minimize gizmos. So here I note that some gizmos have unexpected performance impacts. I've listed a few. Text gizmos contain textures that are constantly rendered regardless of culling. Particle gizmos can contain logic that can cost a lot of CPU time when overused. Dynamic lighting gizmos require world lighting calculations, and audio gizmos, especially positional audio, can heavily impact performance. So those are just like, things to kind of scare you away from gizmos a little bit. But if you have to have it, then place it. But any ways you can like optimize or reduce, those are going to be some good spots to look first. We're here to the demo. So I'm gonna go ahead and go through the demo, and then I'll do the questions right after this. So if you want to, test spawning, you can search in the public access, you can search spawn tester or MHCP mentor. It's this part, MHCP mentor is case sensitive. Spawn tester is not. I don't know why. So if you want to search those, you can get the new asset I created this morning, which is this guy right here. So all this is a asset that can take a property here, an asset property. So I'm going to put island in there. And the way it works, let me move this. Move this out of the way. All right. The way it works is it creates a custom UI, which has a reference to the spawn asset, which is the island that I just put in there, and a spawn position, which is just this this item over here to be where the reference to where the item would spawn. So this is a great way to like test problematic assets. Like go ahead and make a blank world and assign your spawn asset in there. Not going to work too well if you are highly dependent on scripts that are at the like base world. If you have if you make a script of all the or an asset of all those scripts and bring them into a new blank world, then you should avoid. It'll help you be able to run this spawn still. Uh, so let's go in and let's take a look at it. I've got some buttons here on the side with some information of what they do. So basically, if you are initializing a spawn controller and then immediately spawning your item, that's, you're going to feel a performance hit there because it has to do both loading and bringing it into the world. And I can demonstrate that when I go and I'll open it in the web version. So what I mentioned during the slides was that you're going to want to use the load function, right? And so all this asset has all those scripts in the spawn test script here. So this is just a very simple script really of using a spawn controller and calling its functions, and it's doing some binding updates so that you're seeing the changes in the UI. But yeah, so I'm going to switch this over to console. I have some console logs in there too, so when you click on a button, you can see what's happening. Here it says initializing spawn controller, and I could click load, have it load the asset. Thing about loading the asset too is like if you decide to to suddenly spawn it, like it'll sort of switch over and go into like the hardcore spawn mode. If you decided, all right, well the player needs it right now, like let's just activate it. But once it's active, currently have a weird thing about this world where it's like sending me really far away from the grid. I think it's because like the things that are there, like the assets that are there are have colliders, so it's pushing me through the floor. But if I was up there still, I could, deactivate the spawner. With the deactivate button, which this one will simply unload the asset, right? But dispose would completely destroy the spawn controller. So that's like if you're needing to do some pretty hardcore memory cleanup. Most of the time, you're pretty good with just deactivating your asset if you're just turning it off. But yeah, so what I want to demonstrate with that is actually doing the performance readout. And I will do that by going to the published version of this world. Let's see. So I published spawn test. I'm gonna go through my alter ego account also so I can actually run the test. Okay. So pressing P will open up the performance metrics. If pressing P does not work for you, don't worry about it. The VR version, like if you have the headset, put the headset on and just do the wrist menu approach to it because it's going to produce the same output. So in this view, when I press that record button, this is where it pops up the start trace window. I'll switch it over to deep. Earlier I mentioned, right, that when you see the deep output, you could basically get a glimpse of what overview does. So what I meant by that was like you can just get a raw output of like frames per second, and just like very high level trace, not anything with like too much detail, like spawning information, things like that. So let me send myself an invite. I have to do it like this because the this performance view takes over. It takes over and makes it to where I can't actually press any buttons on the window. So what I do is I have my other account do activate the spawn, and I just trace it off of this account. So let's get this guy in here. Okay, so this one will initialize, and I will open up my trace here. Start a deep capture, right? So I'm going to wait like 3 seconds, and then I'm going to press activate because I want to see like the worst case scenario. It's loading. Boom. Okay. And then I'll just go a little bit longer. So in my case, like the trace was much longer than 10 seconds. So like, if that's the case, it's a pretty heavy asset. uh and it often is, right, when you're dealing with it at this level, when it's this impactful. So let's go over to our creator portal. All right. In the performance tab, we will view our traces here. Okay. So we have the trace name right here. Remember earlier I mentioned that it will have both like client files and server files, right? And we'll look at both of them, kind of compare, contrast. The best thing about the traces is this guy right here, the date created. That's, when you've got a lot of traces going on, this is your saving grace. Pro tip, give it a minute after you've done a trace. Give it a minute, so that it gets, literally goes 1 more minute, and it doesn't get confusing. Or sometimes it's even better to give it 10 minutes so that you have, a different number in your tens place here, or your 10-minute spot there. Sometimes when you're like in the deep flow of it, you'll start to trace them too quick, and then you'll start to lose your files and not remember which thing happened when. So yeah, like try to space it out to where the basically the time serves almost as like a folder. So what I want to do here is take a look at client 0. Let's open that. So this is what I meant by the open trace button is a drop down that has the Perfetto option. In here, we'll give it a second. Eventually, it'll open the trace. Okay. From in here, you can press the process to take a look at everything that occurred. Let's see what we got going on. So here you can see some spawn stuff happening. And you can hold control and scroll to zoom. When you click and hold this little section over here, you can scrub around the timeline. So I'm going to scroll down just a bit so we can take a look at the FPS right here. So nothing too crazy during this spawn phase of my like client file here. Oh, let's not do that. Trying to scroll, but it's this guy. Okay. So yeah, so just a couple dips, but that's like sort of expected. Let me zoom all the way back out so we could take a glimpse of the time spots that I mentioned. So in this file, you can see this is happening. This thing says, no, I think that's the time. This is 0 seconds. This is 10 seconds over here. So this one file has about 10 seconds of data, right? And here you can see like I started the actual spawn at the 5-second mark. Let's switch over to client file one, right? So you can go back, click open, or click Perfetto, and you could keep searching, seeing the rest of the impact. So here's a really interesting one right here. So take a look at what happened in this section here, right? The frame rate is dropping pretty hardcore, uh, as low as 48. And you can see right here, this frame that is experienced by the player, like that they don't see a visual update until this 784 milliseconds has passed by, right? So when you are doing your trace, if you see a big spot like this, that's a indicator that you've got some spawning performance impact. Now, if it's somewhat bearable, right? Like it's not too big, then maybe it's more trouble than it's worth. But if it is pretty massive, it's definitely worth yeah, you don't want VR players to feel spikes at all. So if you see anything like that, you don't want that at all, right? You can see on the sides here that baseline numbers I was talking about, right? You can see 16 milliseconds, 15 milliseconds. That's a pretty steady frame rate. Anytime you're seeing those big frame slices like that, that's where it hit. Something hit really strong there. Check it out. Sunlight, right? Something about the dynamic lights, or even just the lights that are being added to that world through the spawn, is it caused a pretty nasty spike here. To the point 48 frames per second. That feels awful in VR. So that's how you can, skim around this space to verify whether you even have an issue at all. Let's take a look at one of the server files just to kind of see what else it's outputting. Oh, I think that was a 1 o'clock file. Went too far down. Here we go. So 743, server 0. Let's see what happens to the server. So here on the server, it's reporting 50 frames, 54 at around the 5-second mark. I don't know if this is accurate, this too, but 43, 53, that's a pretty heavy hit. You can also see other things happening, right? Like Skydome assets spawning. That it might actually be the case that like loading something like a Skydome could cause an impact like that. And Skydomes are a gizmo, so remember, reducing that as much as possible is ideal. Great. Look at these big frame slices, right? That's the player's really gonna feel those. More in VR than in web and mobile, but even still, just performance enhancements are always good. Remember, things tend to add up, right? These, like, maybe you started with a couple things that were unoptimized, and then you have way too many things that are unoptimized, and the game becomes unplayable. Not fun when that happens. So let me go back here and just kind of skim whatever I might be missing. Yeah, I mean that's a the rest is mostly just like organizing your spawning, which I encourage you to try. If we want to sort of we can do a sort of pseudo example of how we might slice a big asset. Let me actually put the asset that I'm loading. It might be familiar to everybody here, if you've been following along with the features, updates, and stuff like that. This is the island file that I just spawned through that spawner. Let's take a look at what it is. You'll see even like dragging it out, right, is quite heavy. So still loading. Probably doesn't help that I'm moving it around. Let's give it a second to load. Okay. So yeah, so this is the Gen AI example. They put that island together, and it's got a lot of stuff on it, right? So if I just converted that into an entire asset, then yeah, that's going to be pretty heavy, right? On my on my spawner, on my world. Um, so when we're looking at this, we could think about um, how we might slice it up. If there is like interactive objects, like I think the coins are in here. Yeah, if there's coins in here, those can be spawned in. You see how there's like several audio files here. Um, if those aren't all needed at once, oops, then spawning those in would be ideal. Um, yeah, it really depends on the kind of game it is too. Particle gizmos. If we had sections of things where that we want to spawn in and out, that might be interesting too. Like for example, let's say we had these, like this boat was animated. Maybe when it goes off into an area that I can't see it anymore, I can despawn it there for a moment. Um, just random thoughts, right? Maybe this section in here only spawns when a player is like about to enter. Maybe there's a fun like loading thing that happens. Um, Yeah, but yeah, you just kind of look at it like that, observe your space and try to see how much of it you can slice up if it's being spawned. Of course, in reality, something like this is mostly a static asset, right? So it's already in the world. But some people have things like, like first person shooter or obby type of maps where you're loading in pretty much full on scenes like those are the ones you want to think about breaking up more. So yeah, so that is what there is to do with spawning and performance. Let's do some questions. Did you use the OVR metrics tool? If I remember correctly, the OVR metrics tool was the small frame rate reader that shows up at the top of like Oculus Store apps. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if you can at least to get an insight as to if your CPU is, or if your frame rate is being affected by things happening in the world. Just be aware that it's not. I haven't used that tool, but I don't know if it would break it down to the level of detail that the Perfetto traces are doing, where it straight up has Horizon events uh, and systems that are reporting their usage to the trace. Um, will just be aware of that if that's not available. That this is the demo I showed is probably the better approach. Um, will this add for all asset, or would this work for all asset types? I need more context around that question. If you're talking about the spawner asset, then yes, just anything you spawn, you just give it the asset and it'll spawn it. Tough on your tummy. Oh yeah, same here. Not a fan of low frame rate worlds in Horizon worlds. I can't be in there too long. Is there a way to have various sounds in the world by using less gizmos, or does each one need its own gizmo? Various sounds in the world by using less gizmo. Like, yes, each sound does, like if it's a different sound, unless something has changed in that realm, if anybody knows, uh, like let's say you had some birds tweeting and you have like a splash of water, right? Like those are two different audio uh, objects. Uh, if the bird tweeting only happens when the players are on one side of the world, uh, maybe you despawn that audio asset and yeah, think about it that way. Like, could you build your world in a way that sort of moves things around, or like the players move around together in such a way that you're able to spawn and despawn things to maximize on the performance, and ideally, just give a smooth user experience to your players. Do static lights have very low performance costs, so you can have many of them? I think this is where the world streaming is like the world streaming API really does a good job because the baked lighting that occurs um, basically if you are building, if you have a separate world that has, let's say you had an obby that you were spawning in, right? And in that obby world, like the level, let's say it's called level one, right? On level one, you have lights that are placed all over the space, right? So all that light information gets baked. And when you use the world streaming API, it's basically like it's good to go. Like it's not, I mean, unless there's like, other lights in the root world that could affect it, then you have to consider those lighting calculations too. Highly recommend uh, you experiment with like these kinds of uh, when thinking about like getting your repository of baseline metrics, right? Like go ahead and like make a blank world with just a ton of assets, and through what you've seen in this session, you can go record those metrics, have those files saved off. It's like this one is 1,000 lights in the world and how the frame rate is affected, right? This one is spawning in 10 dynamic lights or 8 dynamic lights and seeing how it affects the frame rate. And then you just grow your repository of like baseline metrics. And if you're so willing, share those on the forums so that you can share that knowledge with others and hopefully they'll reciprocate. Or you just, you get the satisfaction of just helping others, and that's always great, right? Um, so yeah, that is the session. So thank you all for coming.